Last week, we profiled one of history's greatest heroes, Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat in World War II, using his influence at great personal risk to save over 100,000 Hungarian Jews from Nazi death camps. I spoke with Rabbi Abraham Cooper at the Simon Wiesenthal Center about Wallenberg's incredible achievement for humanity.
He didn't have to be there. He came from Sweden. He had the sort of Rockefeller name of the Wallenberg family, didn't have to put himself in harm's way, and chose to use everything about diplomacy to actually serve humankind as opposed to the interests of politicians and actually of nations. He's a great hero, unbelievable courage, who actually faced down Adolf Eichmann face to face in Budapest and used the threat of war crime trials after World War II with the top German general who was about to blow up the Jewish ghetto at the very end of the Second World War. It is a black mark on history and on humanity that we allowed a man like that to disappear into the Gulag and have never really given his family a definitive answer of what actually took place when his life actually ended.
Now, if you were watching our Canadian Common Sense on Friday, you know that Wallenberg saved 100,000, including my own mum. She was only 9 at the time. And so I'm grateful to Mr. Wallenberg for my own existence. Wallenberg now being honored at the Canadian War Museum. And for that, I want to thank this great country. Now and then, when the push from Canada and other allies in the West brought down the Nazis before they could completely finish their evil work. Joining us for much more is Canada's Immigration Minister, Jason Kenney. Now, Minister Kenney, I said on the air on Friday that I would find a way. I can't thank Wallenberg. He's dead. He was eliminated by the Russians shortly after his very, very good deeds, his heroism. But I can thank the person representing the government who has decided to acknowledge Mr. Wallenberg and memorialize him at his museum. And so, thank you so much.
Well, Charles, I saw your segment last week. I was very touched by your own story, and it's a story of over 100,000 people who were saved by the heroic actions of Wallenberg. Heroism is an overused word. It's become a bit cliche. Wallenberg demonstrates real heroism. For every one of those lives that he saved, he risked his own life. He knew what he was in the midst of. And it's almost like what happened to him is almost like out of fiction, that he managed to survive the war, to stare down Adolf Eichmann, the author of the Holocaust, to save over 100,000 Jews by giving them Swedish passports or stopping the Nazis from blowing up the Jewish ghetto in Budapest. And yet, at the end of the war, he went out to greet the surging Red Army as it was coming towards Budapest and to try to negotiate for the protection for the Jews. And there, he was taken prisoner by the Red Army, sent to Siberia, we believe, and disappeared into the mist of time.
Minister Kenney, I know you're a student of history. We've had lots of time to armchair quarterback World War II, all of the hideous events, including the Holocaust. Do you have the impression from your studies that if one man at Wallenberg could have made this much of a difference to this many people, over 100,000, that perhaps there were many governments that could have made a significant difference and cut down on the loss of life?
Absolutely. And speaking of one man, Roy, the Canadian immigration policy, Charles, the Canadian immigration policy before and during the Second World War was known as, later became known as, none is too many. That was the telegraph that was sent by the Deputy Minister of Immigration when, in 1938, when the SS St. Louis was trying to seek safe harbor in Halifax with 830 European German Jews who were fleeing Hitler, and Canada refused to take any of them, as it refused to take any, virtually no, European Jewish refugees before and during the war. Mackenzie King allowed this to happen. Quite frankly, it's a part of our history we don't like to talk about. Our government's been the first in Canadian history to recognize what I believe was an implicitly anti-Semitic immigration policy during that period. Other countries did much more. The Dominican Republic welcomed, I think, something like 40,000 European Jewish refugees, a little tiny Caribbean country. Canada, at most, accepted a few hundred. And think about it, Wallenberg, in the midst of the The height of the Holocaust, 1944-45, saves over 100,000. How many other diplomats refused to issue passports or wouldn't stand up directly to the Nazis? And so he is a template for all of us, which is why Canada is working with Israel and Sweden and Hungary this year to commemorate the 100th anniversary of his birth. We've issued a special Canada Post commemorative stamp. We have this international exhibition that's at the War Museum. It'll be in Toronto shortly. I attended commemorations in Budapest and in Stockholm. We've named the largest room in our embassy in Stockholm after him. He was declared an honorary Canadian citizen in 1985 by the Parliament of Canada. And we're now calling on the Russian Federation to release all of the archival materials about what happened to Wallenberg after he was taken prisoner by the Red Army.
What do you think specifically happened to Raoul Wallenberg?
You know, what we do know is that when he went out to meet the Red Army, after the Nazi occupation of Hungary was collapsing, he went out to meet them apparently with the intent of ensuring the safety of Budapest Jews, but he was taken prisoner. It's believed the Soviets regarded him as a Western spy, and he just simply disappeared. There is no trace. Now, I gather that some limited amount of archival information has been released, but most of it has not been. The family, the Wallenberg family, who I met both in Stockholm and members of whom were here in Ottawa for the opening of the exhibition, are calling on the government of the Russian Federation to open up all of the relevant archives to find out what happened to him. The best guess, Charles, is that he was taken to a gulag camp in Siberia after the war, and like millions of others, ended up dying, probably in a forced labor camp.
Minister Kenney, you talked a few moments ago about the none is too many policy that our government tragically followed during World War II. Let's build a bridge from that. What is the policy today if there is something that is on the level of the Holocaust where a government or a series of governments are trying to eliminate, trying to commit a genocide? What's Canada's position on that?
Listen, obviously our position is that we believe the International Convention on the Prevention of Genocide should be enforced, and that's why we've raised very profound concerns, for example, about the public incitements to genocide of the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. That's one of the reasons Canada leads the annual resolution at the United Nations condemning the atrocious Iranian human rights record, including this incitement to genocide. And I should commend my colleague Irwin Cotler for taking a leadership role on this. And so we are obviously a world leader in opposing all, including what happened in Darfur a few years ago. We have to recognize that genocide's not over. Just 4 years ago, Canada was the first Western country to recognize the genocide of Stalin's Holodomor planned famine in Ukraine that is estimated to have killed between 6 and 10 million people, but generally isn't known and was covered up by the Western media, including the New York Times, when it actually occurred. So we have to recognize these things in the past, as we have the Armenian genocide, the Holodomor, and we also have to recognize them when they're going on in current reality, including changing our laws so that we can more quickly deport people who've been involved in genocide, like, for example, Leon Mugesera, the Rwandan leader who was responsible for inciting the Rwandan genocide. It took us 20 years to get him out of this country, which in my view is unacceptable.
Minister Kenney, you've laid out some new criteria for those coming to our country. In many cases, they're known coast to coast as bogus refugees. You've talked about safe countries. What's the latest coming from your department?
Well, Charles, as we were just discussing, it's so important for Canada to maintain our humanitarian tradition of protection for refugees, people who are fleeing persecution. And the changes we're making will, I think, enhance that reputation. We're actually creating a new appeal division that allows, at the Immigration Refugee Board, that allows rejected asylum claimants for the first time in our system a full fact-based appeal. But at the same time, we're dealing with the unfortunate reality that many people who make asylum claims in our fair and generous system don't actually need our protection, but are effectively jumping the immigration queue with false false persecution stories. So we need to be soft-hearted, but also a little bit hard-headed about distinguishing the real refugees from those who make false claims and abuse our generosity. And so what we'll be doing under the new system that launches on December 15th is giving a hearing and protection to real victims of persecution, real refugees, in a couple of months, as opposed to the broken old system where it took almost 2 years to do that. But at the same time, we'll be in a position to remove clearly false asylum claimants in a few months rather than allowing them to stay in Canada for several years using redundant administrative recourses, during which time often it becomes unfair for them. They get settled in Canada. We come along 6 years later and say, now you have to go. In the future, we'll be able to do that in a few months. So this is a much more humane system, I think, both for the bona fide refugees who need protection and for the false claimants who, if they want to come to Canada, are welcome to get in the queue for legal immigration like hundreds of thousands of other people.
Minister Kenney, thanks for the great work that you do, and thank you once again for making sure that Raoul Wallenberg is memorialized at the Canadian War Museum. Thank you very much.
Thanks for remembering him, Charles. Thank you.